of Karaka, that extent of additional development will really trigger the Waimatu Karaka Bridge.
Right. That's a good example.
As an example.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
That Councillor Penrose is keen on. No, I'm just kidding.
No, but
No, we don't talk about the Karaka Bridge. Okay, that's useful. Thank you. All right. Should we move on to what is quite a long presentation on the coastal plan? Thank you so much, Anne. So there's a lot of detail in the coastal plan presentation, but I'm going to recommend that we trot through this again reasonably briskly. I think we'll go right the way through, John, and again, it just is for our reference to understand where we've actually got to.
Okay, so we have Kath Coombs here, our lead planner on the coastal plan. We had a team of about 3 or 4 planners on the coastal plan, and let's make sure we've got the right slides up here. 5 planners. So, but I think that reflects the fact that a coastal plan, it's one of those mandatory things that you must have as a regional authority, and generally preparing a coastal plan is a pretty serious undertaking. So we again have the advantage of the operative regional coastal plan, which had some great aspects to it that we were able to roll over into unitary plan speak and format. So we had a good base to work from in that regard. Don't think I really need to go over this in too much detail. It manages activities in the coastal marine area. That's from mean high water springs out to 12 nautical miles. It sheets back to the function of a regional council under the RMA. It deals with coastal permits, which are where you occupy the coastal marine area with things like wharfs and buildings and so on, and aquaculture. They have a 35-year time limit, unlike a consent for a building, which would last forever. In the CMA, under a regional coastal plan, there's generally a 35-year time limit before you have to get those permits renewed. Must give effect to that NZCPS New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act, must comply with marine pollution regulations, and interestingly the Minister of Conservation has the last word on the coastal plan, on a regional coastal plan. Council essentially adopts the coastal plan, but the Minister approves it, whereas for the regional policy statement and the district plan, it's the Council that approves the plan. So I guess in that regard, the Minister can make changes to the coastal plan. Don't know if that's happened elsewhere, has it? Once. So once since the RMA came out, the Minister of Conservation has amended a coastal plan that's gone through its entire process under a regional council. So the structure of the coastal plan, we have, as with land, all parts of the coastal marine area are zoned on the maps. Mostly general coastal marine, that's the red one there, and then we have a marina zone, a mooring zone, minor port, ferry terminal, defence and coastal transition zones. They essentially build on or modify the approach in the general coastal marine area. Many of the overlays that apply on land also cut across the CMA. So we have marine ecological areas, we have standing and high natural character areas on land and in the CMA. Landscapes, natural features, they're all historic heritage, mana whenua sites and the view shaft. So all of those overlays actually, in many cases, traverse land and the CMA. There are some policies in the regional policy statement dealing with coastal issues, and we ran through that before, including biodiversity, landscapes, natural features. Some zones, overlays and precincts extend from land and the CMA, so we've had a great approach with the unitary plan where instead of having to move from a document produced by the regional council to a document produced by a district council, where it makes sense, in some cases we have a zone that actually straddles both sides of mean high water springs, and there's some advantages and simplification by doing that. And then, as on land, we have precincts for particular areas of the coast that warrant a special treatment. We have a mana whenua management area, rowing and paddling, navigation channel. I won't read them all out, but they are some areas where there are specific provisions over and above the zone provisions or any overlays. This map's quite a neat one here. It shows you all of those elements, or many of those overlays. So just to point a few out, that's the Waitemata navigation channel in through here, which has some specific provisions. That's a precinct in red. We have many view shafts. So here's a view shaft out to Rangitoto from the Harbour Bridge, which cuts across land and the CMA. What else do we have here? We have outstanding natural feature, Miola Reef, outstanding natural features at the fossil forest in Milford, Takapuna here in the CMA, significant ecological areas around Little Shoal Bay and Shoal Bay. So that's kind of how the coastal plan is constructed. Coastal plan has roughly, I think, 20 or so discrete topics. Certainly won't read them all out, but they traverse everything from reclamation in the coast through to discharging stormwater and wastewater into the CMA, aquaculture to the Devonport Naval Base, all covered in the coastal plan chapter. And unlike the regional policy statement, we're dealing here not just with objectives and policies for these areas, but the specific rules, the things that tell you what needs a consent, what doesn't need a consent, what limitations there are on those activities. So in terms of the submissions, generally these were the areas where there were some unresolved issues, and it tended to be the detailed wording of policy, activity status, debates about whether something should be discretionary or non-complying, issues around notification. With infrastructure, a lot of work took place in mediation to try and narrow the issues, but there were still some points of disagreement between the council, other submitters and the infrastructure providers who were seeking a more permissive approach within the overlays. New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement has a policy that uses the phrase functional and operational need to be in the CMA and support for things that have that functional and operational need. What the unitary plan's response to that policy in the NZCPS should be was still outstanding between council and some submitters. Port of Auckland was seeking some specific exclusions, and those issues were unresolved, and how to provide for existing activities or structures in the CMA, exactly how that was dealt with some unresolved issues. Having said all of that, probably, I think, 3 weeks of mediation, 3 full weeks of mediation, and some excellent work by all parties and the mediator to try and narrow the issues. So a lot of issues were resolved in a very successful and probably the most extensive mediation that we've had on any single part of the plan. So what you see on this slide here is the range of topics that were agreed. So more than half of those 20 or so topics were largely agreed between the council and all submitters. There might have been a few outstanding issues, but widespread agreement. And what we'll do for the next part of the presentation is take you through the areas where there were some unresolved issues. With the same format, we'll talk about what was in the plan, what the submitters asked for, and what the council's position was. And that's really just to cover all these topics where there was agreement. We'd be here for most of the evening. So I'll hand over to Kath at this point to talk you through those topics where there were still some outstanding issues.
So as you all know, there are quite a few issues around the region with mangrove expansion. The notified plan has a range of permitted activities for seedlings and for mangrove trees where areas were free of mangroves in 1996, and if they're in significant ecological areas that are listed because they've got wading bird habitats or they're identified as not having mangrove specific values. We had submitters come in from both sides, some seeking more allowance for removals, both everywhere and at particular sites they wanted to discuss, and then other people saying that any removal should require consent. So it was interesting, no one came in saying there should be no mangrove removals. So that end of the spectrum was actually pulled back to just where there is removal, it should be through a consent process rather than a permitted activity. The key change that we made at the hearing was agreeing to a permitted activity in the Whangatiao Harbour if the area was free of mangroves in 1948 rather than 1996. Our ecological expert went out on site with the submitters and agreed that there have been issues since the causeway went in there with expansion. and based on the evidence that was available, that's an appropriate time for that one site. Aquaculture. So in the notified plan, new marine farms are a discretionary activity in the general coastal marine zone, and then prohibited or non-complying in the overlay areas with identified values. Reconsenting existing marine farms is restricted discretionary and discretionary in the overlays. And the overlays had little rectangle holes in them for where there are existing marine farms, just recognising that already those existing farms there. The submitters came in generally from the marine farmers, saying reconsenting should be a controlled activity and there should be more allowance for expansions, realignments and for experimental marine farms. They're seeking more certainty based on the level of infrastructure and investment that they've got in their sites, and noting that even though they will have to seek consents in future, they want more certainty that they'll be granted them. So our position at the hearing on this, new marine farms non-complying in all the overlays rather than prohibited in some, reconsenting is restricted discretionary where it was discretionary in some overlays, and we've made some allowances for minor extensions and realignments as a restricted discretionary activity and discretion in the overlays, just to make some of those farms more economic and usable. If they're realigned or extended slightly, it gives them more certainty to stay in those places rather than expand to different locations. And there is now some recognition of the value of experimental aquaculture with limits and greater policy guidance on how you might do that and a precautionary approach that would need to be taken. And we've taken out the cutouts in the overlays to recognise that when those overlays were identified, they recognised the values of those farms, and they're now recognised as an element of that significant landscape or ecological area, to make it clear of how that area would be considered in future consent processes. Livestock access. So in the notified plan, all livestock access to the CMA was going to be a prohibited activity, but after different time periods, depending on which overlay you're in or if you're in the general zone. This reflects an NZCPS policy which encourages a quite restrictive approach to livestock, but there were submitters that came in saying it shouldn't be regulated at all, or it shouldn't be regulated in the overlays, or it should be allowed for in the overlays, and that it should be restricted discretionary rather than prohibited. The council's position was to go for a non-complying activity rather than prohibited activity, accepting that there may be situations where farmers have no option but to allow limited livestock access, so there should be an opportunity for them to apply for a consent. And it's permitted activity in all other areas apart from in the degraded areas. The NZCPS policy does focus on areas where water quality has been degraded rather than everywhere in the CMA, so we've pulled back to recognise some of the concerns and be more in line with the NZCPS. We've also recognised that horse riding was pulled in a bit too extensively, and it's now a permitted activity in all areas. It's controlled in other ways, such as through the bylaw. Mineral extraction. The notified plan pulled sand mining and oil extraction together in the same policies as they are both classed as minerals under the RMA. Prospecting and exploration are permitted activities, non-complying or prohibited in the overlays, and extraction is discretionary in the general coastal marine. Extraction is discretionary, non-complying or prohibited in the overlays. The distinctions between prospecting, exploration and extraction are different scales of work relating to the type of work and the size of samples or mining that's being undertaken. So submitters sought a more restrictive approach to extraction for petroleum wells, which is included in exploration. And so our position at the hearing was that we recognised this need for a more precautionary approach for petroleum exploration. and we've now grouped that with extraction rather than prospecting. So in terms of sand mining, exploration is sort of grab samples, but with petroleum, exploration involves drilling wells, which can be there for quite a long time.